Hi, I'm Mira Selva from the Reuters Institute. I have with me Renee Kaplan, Head of Audience Engagement at the Financial Times. We're here to talk about new forms of storytelling, new ways to reach new audiences, and how best to use technology and new platforms in order to bring your products to the people you need to reach. Hi, Renee. The Financial Times has really focused on looking at different ways to get its news and its stories out there. And you are now looking at new forms of digital storytelling. Could you talk a little bit about what you mean by that?
Sure. It involves actually any number of products and concepts and actually just formats. But really it starts from the perspective of the audience and thinking about where they are and how they want to and need to consume news and stories and the diversity of ways that we can actually go find them where they are. In some ways, this is now sort of the basic bread and butter of what distribution is, and it's sort of the brave new world of no longer being able to expect readers to come to us. It's no longer the FT gets delivered in the morning or you buy it in the newsstand. It really is thinking about the variety of people we want and how we get to them. So some of them are in their phones on our app. Some of them are at their desktops Googling us and finding our stories and coming through search. Some of them are on social media, whether it's Facebook or Twitter. Some of them are subscribing to our channels on WhatsApp. And all of this is part of the ecosystem that we need to be thinking about targeting. Subscribers, but also prospects, people who we want to begin to expose to the brand. So when we think about any one story, we'll think about all the ways that we can tell it, or the different audiences and the different platforms and how relevant a certain kind of story might be for them. So I'll give a concrete example. We cover, as the Financial Times, the consulting and accounting industry closely. So this is things like KPMG or McKinsey or big law firms. These are huge industries and a big part of our stories. And we discovered, I guess improbably, unexpectedly, that our social media audience, which is a slightly younger audience, a slightly more American audience than, say, our on-site audience, really engage with these stories. Anytime you wrote about one of the big four, like Ernst & Young or KPMG or one of the big consulting firms, it would get hundreds and hundreds of shares, it would get a ton of engagement, lots of click-through. So we realized that looking then on the kind of audience that was clicking through to these stories, that it was more anonymous than subscribers, so real prospects, and actually more Asian than UK or American. So we realized, okay, as and when we have stories about these topics, we really need to think about how to optimize them for social. So creating specific promotional cards for those social platforms, thinking even about creating social videos in which we might do a summary of the story that links to the full story. And really then thinking about audience, channel, and format in that order.
I mean, the Financial Times, one of your biggest strengths is your brand and your reputation and your identity. Have you had to work at maintaining that across the different formats and the different platforms you go out on?
That's a really good question. In the sense that, especially when thinking about how global we want to be as a brand, and indeed how global and borderless offsite platforms are, it's no longer that print or even frankly that kind of local audience that you could imagine with a traditional newspaper. And interestingly, the Financial Times, while it is a global brand, it is London-based, it's UK-based. And in the UK, it's an extremely well-known brand. And to some extent, we don't have to translate or convert. We're preaching to the converted in terms of the trustworthiness and the quality and even the breadth of the Financial Times. Even though it's called financial, it's actually about politics and the global economy and even culture and life and arts and opinion. What we have to take into account when we think about our distribution across global platforms, which are borderless and actually completely free to all access, is people may not even know the brand. They may not be familiar with it, or they may see Financial Times and assume it's exclusively a business or finance paper. So there's always a presumption of needing to translate, a presumption of needing to kind of present content in a way and a language and a format that doesn't speak for itself, that doesn't assume a familiarity or even a trust or an engagement with the brand. And so it's always a position of trying to earn those things rather than assuming them. You try to get as much knowledge as possible about the audience on that platform. So for example, we know that if we think about social media again, we know that our Twitter audience is older, higher revenue, and more UK than US or Asian. whereas our Facebook audience is much younger, much more American, and in fact much more global and Asian and much more mobile than any of our other audiences. So we'll think about the tone, we'll think about how we'll adjust certain posts, how about the actual curation. To some extent, we really think about those offsite platforms as independent publishing platforms. We're curating FT content and editing it much in the way that we would curate a homepage or curate a whole website specific to that audience.
Let me take you on that and take you to your recent, most well-known story in a way, the President's Club story, which exposed sexual harassment and inappropriate behaviour amongst city elites at a charity event. This story you put outside your paywall, and I think it was the most clicked-on story on your website ever.
Yes.
And you brought in new audiences and new readers for that, and created quite a fury. What did you do with these new readers once they came? How did you make sure they stayed, and did they stay with you later on?
That's a very good question. To some extent, I'm going to give you a different answer though.
Okay.
Only because what we realized, first of all, was that this was a bigger opportunity than we had imagined.
Mm-hmm.
And we realized this about 8 hours into the publication of the story, before we had actually made it available to all readers, before we had made it free. We realized it was getting extraordinary traction.
Mm-hmm.
And most of the traction was getting, most of the engagement, most of the unexpected, in some ways, I would say tsunami of traffic, was through social media.
Yeah.
It just went viral in a way that, in the sens propre viral, where it just spreads without our controlling it or without our necessarily having engineered it. And when people come through social media, they are actually able to click through for free once. There's most news media, including the FT, have what's called a one-click free policy with every social media platform, where you can click through, even if you're not a subscriber, once a day for free and access it. So we realized rapidly that the bulk of the audience, anyway, even though we had a huge subscriber audience, we had an even bigger proportion of the audience that was coming through social and coming through for free anyway. So we thought, it's going organically viral. It's being shared quite organically by people who maybe even have never engaged with the brand before. In fact, we were able to see that many of those anonymous, as we call them, readers, were first-time readers. They weren't return readers. So we thought this is an opportunity, not necessarily to get people and get them to stay or come back, but it's to get people to be familiar or get to know the brand, who may never have even come into contact with the brand before, who may not even realize that the FT, the Financial Times, would cover a topic like sexual misconduct, would cover a topic in a kind of investigative undercover manner, and would have a kind of coverage that's much more general and global, and in some ways accessible in its reach and its tone than other people might presume. So, long story short, we really thought of it more as a way to familiarize people with the brand and to get broad reach for the brand, rather than to actually cultivate and bring back audiences.
Okay. But then, did you try to cultivate them later or bring them back?
That's very hard to do if you think about how audience strategy works. Audience strategy, in order to be able to bring people back, works if you can identify them. And you identify people when you have a certain geography you can target, and you can begin to get some evidence around how a particular geography or propensity of a certain platform's audience will behave. And then you try to cultivate some kind of curation around what they're showing in terms of a preference for topics or formats or a time of day they might come back. In this instance, it was so massively a new audience and so global, there was no real way necessarily to capture the behavior because it was quite eclectic and quite scattered. What we were able to do, to some extent though, was capture the storytelling of this event and realize that by continuing to promote the story across all of our social media platforms, not just the day after or 2 days after, but for a full week after, and with many different formats. We had a longer video format, we had a social video format. We then had multiple spin-off stories that were products of continuing investigation. We knew that by continuing to promote those heavily on social, we might get some of those same people to continue sharing it, or we might get people noticing it in their feed or coming back for it. We're not able to track it, but that was the gamble that we took.
I mean, again, staying on that story, because I think it's a really fascinating case study, your comment section was really extraordinary, because you also had a lot of anger from existing readers that this wasn't what they were expecting of the FT. Did you lose readers, or did you get many angry letters about this?
We didn't and we didn't. There is always a core, and usually a very vocal, but small core of active objectivist commenters. And we see that around lots of different topics. We see it around Brexit, we see it around gender pay gap stories, we see it around any variety of topics that are the polarizing topics. The readers who objected to seeing this kind of coverage were actually far outnumbered than the readers who were really gratified and surprised and pleased that a media as credible and as respected as the Financial Times would take this on. And in fact, the phenomenon that we saw in the comments that we found very gratifying was that we ourselves as moderators didn't have to go into the comments at all. It was other readers, other subscribers who went in and said, actually responded to the people who were critical or found this gratuitous or found it to be facile or in some ways inappropriate and said, actually, speak for yourself. This is probably typical of behavior in the city and it's good that we're finally speaking of it or revealing it or understanding more about it, and that I would rather the FT be doing it than others. And again, it was other readers coming in and stepping in. And we found actually that when that does begin to happen, it creates a much more virtuous circle of comments that then engender a conversation. It actually really pivots the tone. And
That's interesting.
In some ways, we're very committed to comments and very committed to creating conversation that's positive, precisely because it is a subscription product. It's a premium subscription product, and part of what our readers pay for is to be part of the conversation. And the huge majority of people commenting are subscribers. They're entitled to it. And so that when they themselves take on this kind of moderation function is when it actually produces the most positive commentary. And again, we got lucky, and readers did it themselves.
That's very heartening. Can I ask you a little bit about editorial analytics, because the FT 3 years ago implemented Lantern, which was kind of an innovative way that journalists could see in real time how their story was doing. How did journalists react to it in the newsroom at the beginning? Were they nervous? Were they excited? And has it changed their behaviour and the way they report and the kind of stories they pitch?
It really has changed the awareness of performance and the understanding of performance in the newsroom. What do I mean by that? Well, newspapers and now news media and journalists have been aware for a while of how when the story's online and on digital, we talk about how did it do. And for a long time, how did it do was measured by page views or clicks. And for a long time, journalists have been very interested in clicks. And in fact, it's a wonderful vanity metric, right? Nothing is more gratifying. And it used to be in the old world that the most gratifying was when the editor liked your story, as maybe your mother. Now it's how many page views did it get. But the understanding of performance had been very limited to page views, and frankly, there wasn't much access even to a sense of performance. When in reality, the value of a story, especially for a paid product like the Financial Times, where we have a smaller audience because we're more about optimizing for engagement rather than absolute broad reach. And so what Lantern, which is an editorial analytics dashboard, a very simple, easy to use, journalist-friendly dashboard, was good at doing, and what it was good at introducing that didn't exist in the newsroom before, was a better understanding of different ways of measuring value. So instead of looking just at page views, which of course really high page views are going to be limited to the limited number of stories that make it on the homepage. We publish between 180 and 200 stories every day. Only a fraction of those are going to make it on the homepage, but many of them are very valuable. And understanding how to give a sense of performance so that journalists can know how they're doing, what audiences are really engaging in, what is of value. Getting a better handle on that has now been introduced into the newsroom, because instead of just looking at page views, they can look at the time spent on a story, or what percentage of a story is bringing in new readers versus subscribers. Where in the world the story is getting the most traction, so maybe understanding what time to file and publish. So all these nuances of performance are now readily accessible to the newsroom, and actually there's a real hunger for this. Because the frustration before was, well, why didn't my story get a lot of page views? And why can't I get on the homepage? And now there's a diversification of understanding about, oh, this is good too.